The oath had 47 lines. Soriel had memorized them at age 6. He had recited them every year since, alone in the practice hall behind the war library, while his tutors counted his words on their fingers and told him to breathe from his chest. He knew the oath better than he knew his own name. He knew which syllables to stretch, which pauses to hold, which word in the 32nd line carried the weight that made the old generals in the back rows stand a little straighter. He was reciting them now, in front of 4,000 witnesses, and his mind was somewhere else entirely. It was raining in his memory. Northern Canada, Earth. A forest so dark and wet that the trees looked like black columns holding up a sky full of water. He had been lying on his back in the mud, bleeding from a wound in his side that had stopped hurting, which he knew from his military training was a bad sign. The ship was gone. The communications array was gone. He had a broken arm, a cracked scale plate over his left ribs, and zero idea how a simple survey flight had ended with him alone on an alien world with no one coming. Then a light had appeared between the trees. Not a weapon. A torch. A small human torch, the kind they carried in their hands, throwing pale yellow light across the wet ground. And behind it, a human woman, short by Dracorath standards, wearing a green coat that was soaked through, carrying a bag with a red cross symbol on the side. She had stopped when she saw him. He had watched her face go through several things very quickly. Surprise. Something that might have been fear. And then, almost immediately, something that replaced the fear before it could settle. Focus. She had knelt beside him in the mud and opened her bag without a word. "I am not going to hurt you," she said, which he found interesting because he was the one bleeding. He had told her, in her own language, that he understood. Her eyes had gone wide at that. She had said nothing about it. She had looked at the wound, looked at her supplies, looked back at the wound, and said, very quietly, as if talking to herself, Okay, we work with what we have." Her name was Rincalloway. He did not learn it until the second day. In the coronation hall, Soriel reached line 32 of the oath and felt the generals in the back rows stand straighter and thought, she would have something to say about all of this. He did not know exactly what she would say. That was part of it. 3 years of studying humanity, of reading their histories and their science reports and their philosophy texts, and he still could not predict what Rincalloway would say in a given situation. He had tried. He had made notes. He had asked the imperial science teams assigned to human research if they had a model for it. They did not. The hall was bright with firelight and the gold of the ceiling. His father sat in the throne above the steps, wrapped in medical supports that had been disguised to look like ceremonial robes. Vareth the Ancient was dying. Everyone in the room knew it. No one said it. That was how the Dracorath court worked. The truth was always present and never spoken aloud until someone made it official. Soriel loved his father. He had told him this twice in his life, which for a Dracorath was considered frequent. He finished line 46. He stopped. The hall was very quiet. Line 47 was the final oath. It was the one that mattered. It was 8 words in the old tongue, and when he spoke them, he would be the crown prince in full, and the machinery of succession would begin, and the throne would be waiting for him when his father let go of it. He thought about Rin in the mud, looking at his wound, and saying, "We work with what we have." He thought about the message she had sent 18 months ago. A short thing. Video format. The way humans preferred. She had looked tired. She had said she had heard there was trouble at the imperial court, and she wanted to know if he was all right. He had replied. She had not replied back. He had waited. He was still waiting. 18 months, and the silence had not gotten smaller. He looked at the hall. He looked at the 4,000 witnesses. He looked at his father, who was watching him with yellow eyes that still held everything that had ever made him frightening. He said the first word of line 47. Then he walked toward the door. It was not a dramatic exit. He did not announce it. He did not draw a weapon or give a speech. He simply redirected his feet while his voice was still finishing the first word, and by the time the sound died and the hall understood what was happening, he was already in the corridor. The honor guard did not stop him. They were trained to stop threats coming in. No one had planned for the threat walking out. He moved through the service corridors he had walked alone twice a week for the last 3 months, memorizing the route the way he memorized the oath, because he had known for 3 months that this moment was coming and he preferred to be prepared. The Gilded Talon was in Bay 14, fueled and cleared, logged as a maintenance rotation because the bay technician owed Soriel a favor from 6 years ago and had not asked any questions. He entered the ship, the door sealed behind him. He sat down in the pilot's seat, which was too small for his frame and always had been, and pulled up the navigation display. He found the last known coordinates of Rin Calloway's signal. He plotted the course. Behind him, through the hull, he could not hear the coronation hall, but he knew what was happening in it. He knew the silence had broken. He knew General Drath was already moving toward his father. He knew the Chancellor was 3 seconds away from the worst evening of his career. He knew the noble houses were recalculating everything they thought they knew about the next 10 years. He engaged the engines. He thought about what Line 47 would have done, the ceremony it would have completed, the years it would have started, the throne that would have become his the moment the word was finished. He thought about Rin Calloway not answering for 18 months. The gilded talon lifted out of Bay 14 and turned toward open sky. By the time the first pursuit order was issued, he was already above the cloud line. By the time the fleet was scrambled, he was at the edge of the atmosphere. By the time anyone reached the bay, the ship was a light in the upper dark, getting smaller. In the throne room, Vareth the Ancient watched the reports come in one by one. The generals looked to him for an order. The Chancellor said something about a crisis. The noble houses sent representatives to the doors within minutes, which told Vareth everything he needed to know about how prepared they had been for exactly this. He let them wait. After a long time he said, "He will come back." He paused. "Or he will not need to." Nobody was sure what that meant. Vareth did not explain. High above the planet, Soriel hit the FTL trigger. The stars turned to lines. He breathed out, slow and even, the way his tutors had taught him, and pulled up Rin's last signal on the screen, and began. The first thing Soriel did when he reached open space was eat something. Not because he was hungry, because Rin would have asked if he had eaten, and if the answer was no, she would have looked at him the way she looked at patients who had done something preventable to themselves. He had spent 2 years trying to avoid that look. Old habits. He found a nutrition block in the ship's emergency stock, ate it without tasting it, and then turned his full attention to the navigation display. The last confirmed signal from Rin Calloway had come through the human Dracorath diplomatic relay 17 months ago. Before that, regular contact, short messages, mostly text, occasionally video. She was not a writer by nature. Her messages were direct and a little blunt and always contained at least one question about something she was currently trying to understand. She had asked him once about Dracorath construction techniques because a bridge near her relief camp had collapsed and she was trying to figure out what had failed. She had asked him once about Dracorath medicine because she had a patient with an unusual reaction to a common compound, and she thought a cross-species comparison might help. She did not ask these things because they were small talk. She asked because she wanted to know, and she had decided he was a useful source. He had found this flattering in a way he had not expected. The last message was a video, 90 seconds long, sent from a relay point in a system called Waymark 9. She looked tired, the way she always looked when she had been working too long, which was most of the time. She said she had heard there was political movement at the imperial court. She said she was not trying to pry. She said she just wanted to know he was all right. He had replied, told her the court was stable enough, told her his father's health was declining but managed, told her, without quite saying it, that he had been thinking about Earth and about the months he had spent there more than was probably appropriate for a man with his responsibilities. He was not sure she would understand the subtext. Rin was good at a great many things. Subtext was not always one of them. She had not replied. He had waited a week, then 2, then a month. He had sent a follow-up, brief, not wanting to seem concerned in a way that would embarrass either of them. Nothing. He had checked with the relay operators. The message had been delivered. The read confirmation was logged. She had read it. She had not answered. He had spent the next 17 months telling himself that she was busy, that the relief circuits she worked were often in low communication zones, that humans had complicated social rhythms around contact and distance that he had not fully mapped. All of this was true. None of it had made the silence smaller. Waymark 9 was a 12-hour FTL jump from Dracker Prime. He arrived at the edge of the system, ran a passive scan, and found what the charts described, a mid-sized commercial station, politically unaffiliated, sitting at the intersection of 3 trade corridors like a stone in a river. The kind of place that survived by being useful to everyone and loyal to no one. He brought the Gilded Talon in at low profile, which was relative, because the Gilded Talon was a diplomatic courier vessel with imperial registry markings that glowed faintly gold in the dark. Low profile for a prince was still conspicuous by most standards. The docking authority asked for his credentials. He gave a secondary ID he had arranged through channels he preferred not to name. It held. The bay assigned to him was in the lower ring, near the fuel processors, which smelled like scorched metal and made a constant low vibration through the floor. He paid the docking fee in a currency 3 steps removed from anything traceable to the imperial treasury. He stepped off the ship and immediately became the most interesting thing on the docking level. Waymark 9 had a diverse population. He counted, in the first 30 seconds, representatives of at least 6 species. None of them were Dracorath. Several of them stopped moving when they saw him. He understood this. He was tall, he was scaled, his eyes were gold, and the cloak he had thrown over his court clothes did not change any of those things. He walked to the station's information desk and asked for the medical records office. The clerk, a small gray-skinned person with very large eyes, looked at him for a long time and then pointed left without speaking. He said thank you. She continued looking at him. He went left. The records office was run by a man named Oven, who had the look of someone who had worked on transit stations long enough that nothing surprised him anymore, and he had decided this was a personal achievement. Soriel explained, without explaining too much, that he was looking for information on a human woman who had passed through the station. He had a name. He had a description. He offered a payment that was large enough to be serious and small enough not to be alarming. Oven pulled up the records. Ren Calloway had arrived at Waymark 9 8 months ago, aboard a civilian freight carrier running a medical supply route through the Kareth corridor. She had worked in the station's medical bay for 6 weeks. Oven said this without expression and then added, after a pause, that the station administrator still talked about those 6 weeks. Soriel asked what she meant by that. Oven said the station medical bay had been rated as functional when Ren arrived and was rated as significantly better when she left, and the administrator's exact phrasing when describing the improvement was, "I don't know how she did it, and I'm not sure I want to know." He asked where she went when she left. Oven checked. She had departed on a vessel called the Harrow's Edge, a civilian medical relief ship registered out of a small human settlement at the edge of the corridor. Destination logged as the Drath mining cluster, 3 jumps deeper into unaffiliated space. He asked when. 7 months ago. He bought Oven a generous second payment, thanked him, and walked back to his ship. In the docking bay, he sat on the loading ramp because the ship's chairs were still too small and he needed to think. 7 months was a long time in unaffiliated space. The Kareth corridor had no imperial fleet presence, no consistent communication infrastructure, and an unofficial economy that ran on contracts nobody filed in triplicate. People went into the corridor for reasons. Those reasons were not always the ones they stated. He pulled up everything on his ship's database about the Drath mining cluster. 6 active sites. Population of maybe 4,000 workers across all sites, mixed species. No permanent medical facility. High accident rate. High demand for traveling relief teams. That was exactly the kind of place Ren would go. He was refiling the navigation plot when his communications array lit up. Encrypted transmission, imperial military grade, routed through 6 relays. He almost did not open it. Then he saw the source identifier. General Drath. Drath was 70 years old and had fought in 4 wars and had been his father's most trusted military advisor since before Soriel was born. He was not a man who sent messages casually. He was also not a man who sent them through 6 encrypted relays unless the content was something that could not be allowed to be intercepted. Soriel opened the message. It was 3 words. They know why. He read it twice. Then he sat very still on the loading ramp of a diplomatic courier ship on a trade station at the edge of unaffiliated space, and he understood exactly what it meant, and he was on his feet before he finished understanding it. He was in the pilot's seat before the ramp had finished retracting. He was in FDL before he had eaten anything else. There was a file in the Imperial archive that Soriel had never been allowed to read. He had known about it for 2 years. He had found the reference by accident while reading through the original survey reports on humanity, the ones filed 30 years ago when the first long-range Dracorath probe had detected radio signals from a small blue planet in an unremarkable system. Most of those reports were available to him. He was the crown prince. He had clearance for almost everything. Almost. The reference appeared in a footnote in the original survey summary, a single line that said the full biological assessment had been transferred to a separate file under direct imperial seal, classification Tier Null, access restricted to the Emperor and the Senior Science Council. Soriel had seen Tier Null classification twice in his life before that. Once for a weapons design that had been developed and immediately buried because its testing had destroyed a moon. Once for a pathogen incident in the outer systems that the court still refused to discuss openly. He had asked his father about the human file. Once. Drath had looked at him for a long time, the way he looked at things he was measuring. Then he had said, "When the time comes, you will read it." That was all. Soriel had not asked again. Drath's message meant the time had come, whether the Emperor intended it or not. Drath had been with Drath since before Soriel's birth. He knew things the court did not. If he had sent 3 words through 6 encrypted relays, he had done it because he could not say more without the risk of being intercepted, and he had decided those 3 words were worth the risk. They know why. Not "there is danger." Not "come home." Why? Soriel had a second set of access codes. Drath had given them to him 4 years ago, in a private meeting with no record, and told him to use them only if he had no other option. He had never used them. He used them now, cutting into the Imperial secure network from a moving FTL ship using a relay trick that one of his intelligence tutors had shown him as a theoretical exercise, and probably regret. The archive opened. He found the Tier Null file on humanity in 11 minutes. He read it for 3 hours. The biological section came first. It was dense and written in the kind of dry technical language that the Imperial Science Council used when they wanted to discuss something alarming without sounding alarmed. The summary, stripped of the careful phrasing, said this: human beings had survived at least 2 extinction-level events in their deep history. Not ordinary disasters. Events that, by the models the Council used for every other species they had studied, should have ended the species entirely. The first was a geological event approximately 70,000 years ago that had reduced the human population to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. The entire species, from a genetic standpoint, had come from that. A number so small it should have meant inbreeding collapse within 3 generations. It had not. The second event was more recent in geological terms. A shift in climate conditions that had lasted thousands of years and killed off nearly every large animal on the planet. The humans had survived that too. Not by luck, by changing, by moving, by eating different things and building different shelters and, according to the archaeological evidence, continuing to make art throughout. The psychological section was shorter and more unsettling. It said that humans showed a consistent response to large-scale catastrophe that did not match any other species in the Dracorath database. Other species, when reduced to critically low populations, showed predictable patterns: resource hoarding, territorial aggression, reproductive collapse, loss of complex social structures. Humans showed some of that. But they also showed something the report called community formation under pressure, which meant that the worse things got, the more they built connections with strangers. The report noted this was counterintuitive and had been checked 3 times. The sociological section described what humans had built in the 30,000 years since the last near extinction. It was long. Soriel had read a version of this before, in the non-classified reports, but this version had the numbers the Council had held back. The speed of their development. The scale of it. The way they had gone from small hunter groups to planetary civilization in a blink of geological time, and had done it while fighting each other constantly, which the Council noted was also counterintuitive and also had been checked 3 times. The final section was the threat assessment. It was 4 pages. Soriel read it twice. The conclusion was 1 sentence. Unknown. Further study required. Handle with care. He sat back in the pilot chair, which was too small, and looked at the ceiling of the gilded talon for a while. He understood now what the file was. It was not a threat assessment in the military sense. It was an admission. The Imperial Science Council, 47 species of data behind them, for 1,000 years of contact history, every model and metric they had ever built, and their conclusion about humanity was, "We do not know. We have never seen this before. We are not sure what it means, and we are not sure what to do about it, so we are going to say handle with care and file it somewhere the public cannot read it and hope for the best. What the file did not say, because the council was thorough but not imaginative, was what happened when another party got hold of it and reached a different conclusion. They know why. Drath's 3 words. They, meaning the noble houses. Or one of them, House Seville, which had the most to gain from the succession fracture, and which had been quietly aggressive about human contact policy for the last 5 years. House Seville, which had voted twice against expanding the diplomatic relay that allowed Rin to send her messages. House Seville, whose territory covered 2 of the entry routes into the Kareth corridor. They knew why Soriel had been sent to Earth, not for a survey, for an assessment of the Tier Null file. They knew what he had been studying, and they had decided, in the way that noble houses decided things, that a human who had been in close sustained contact with the Crown Prince was a variable worth removing. She had not stopped answering because she was busy. She had stopped answering because someone had made it very clear to her that being easy to find was dangerous. And she had not told him because she was protecting him, or protecting whoever might be traced through him to her. Because that was what she did. That was the pattern the report kept circling without naming. When the situation got worse, she moved toward the people who needed help and away from anything that put them at risk. Soriel closed the archive. He looked at the navigation display. He was 6 hours from the Drath cluster. He thought about a woman in a wet green coat kneeling in the mud of a Canadian forest and saying, "We work with what we have." He increased speed to the maximum the Gilded Talon could hold in FTL. Then, because he had not eaten since the nutrition block on Waymark 9, and it had now been 11 hours, he went to the ship's emergency stock and found something else. He ate it standing up, one hand on the navigation display, watching the jump clock count down. He thought about the report's last line, handle with care. He thought about what Rin would say if she knew the most powerful scientific body in a 4,000-year empire had looked at her species and said, "We do not understand this." She would probably say something short and practical and accidentally devastating, the way she always did. He found he was looking forward to hearing it. The jump clock hit 0. He dropped out of FTL, began calibrating for the next jump, and picked up a distress signal. It was human frequency. It was 3 light minutes away, inside a debris field that had not been on any chart he had. And it was using a pattern he recognized, because on a cold, wet night in a Canadian forest 3 years ago, between the second and third time she had redressed the wound in his side, he had shown Rin Calloway a Dracorath distress sequence as a kind of joke, a way to pass the hours, and she had memorized it in under 10 minutes and said, "just in case," in a tone that was not entirely joking. He turned the ship. He did not bother with the navigation plot. He flew by the signal. The debris field smelled like burned metal even through the ship's sensors. Soriel had been in combat situations before. Not many. The Dracorath Empire had been at formal peace for 60 years, which meant wars happened, but they were called other things: enforcement actions, border corrections, peacekeeping operations. He had studied them all from command distances. He had never personally fired weapons at something that was firing back. He assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. The Harrow's Edge was a mid-range civilian transport, the kind used by independent relief organizations that could not afford dedicated medical vessels. It was not built for combat. It had no weapons. What it had was a hull that was still mostly intact, a power signature that said something inside was still running on emergency reserves, and a distress signal broadcasting on a frequency that only 2 people in this system would recognize. Around it, holding position like guards at a locked door, were 3 drones. Soriel recognized the design. Private military contractor models, the kind that were not registered to any government and therefore technically did not exist until they did something that someone needed to answer for. They were automated. They were scanning the wreck. They were not leaving. The Gilded Talon's weapons were ceremonial grade. He knew this. Diplomatic courier vessels were not meant to fight. They were meant to look impressive at formal arrivals and carry communications securely between systems. The weapons were present mostly so the vessel could not be accused of being unarmed. He armed them. He had, as noted, studied a great number of wars from command distances. He ran the attack from instinct and from 30 years of war theory that had never quite been tested and turned out to work reasonably well under pressure. The first drone did not respond fast enough because it was not designed to deal with an incoming vessel that came in hot and did not broadcast any identification. The gilded talon hit it from the side, and the drone's power core went in a clean, silent flash. The second drone responded. He took a hit on the portside hull that rattled every surface in the ship and knocked him sideways in the pilot's seat. He corrected, came around on a tighter angle than the gilded talon was rated for, and destroyed the second drone by flying directly at it and firing at point-blank range on the way past. The maneuver was not in any flight manual. He was fairly certain it voided the ship's maintenance warranty. The third drone locked onto him. He could see it acquiring a targeting solution on the display. He was pulling for angle and not finding one fast enough. The drone was smarter than the first two, or its targeting system was faster, or both. Then something hit it from the side. Not his fire. Something from the wreck. He saw it on the sensor display. A projectile, large and fast, coming from the cargo section of the Harrow's Edge. The drone's targeting broke. It spun. Soriel fired while it was still spinning, and that was the end of the third drone. He took 30 seconds to breathe and check the hull damage. The port side hit had punched through an outer panel, but the pressure seals had held. The gilded talon was flyable. Probably not race-ready. Flyable. He brought the ship alongside the Harrow's Edge and matched airlocks. The docking tube connected with a thud that rang through both vessels. He pulled on an emergency breather because he did not know the atmospheric status on the other side, and he had learned, from one very memorable incident in a malfunctioning research station 3 years ago, not to assume. Then he opened the airlock. The air on the other side was cold and tasted like smoke and something chemical that he identified, from his medical cross-training, as cauterizing compound, the kind used for wound treatment when proper equipment was not available. He moved toward the sound of voices. The cargo bay was at the rear of the ship. The door was partially jammed, and he had to put his shoulder into it, which he did without ceremony. It opened. There were 11 people in the cargo bay. 2 of them were on makeshift supports that someone had constructed from supply crates, wall panels, and what appeared to be tubing from the ship's secondary water system. 3 more were sitting against the wall with bandaging that was, given the available materials, impressively done. The rest were standing or moving, tending to the ones who could not. And at the center of all of it, her back to him, her voice calm and her hands working, was Rin Calloway. She had a gash across her forehead that had been closed with adhesive strips, the kind you put on yourself in the field because there is no one else to do it. Her jacket was the same green one she had been wearing in the video message, now significantly worse off. She was telling someone what to do in a tone that did not leave room for disagreement. She heard the door. She turned. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a long moment. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "You are impossible to find." She said, "You weren't supposed to be looking." He said, "That was never going to work." She turned back to the person she had been treating, finished what she was doing, said 2 more things to the person next to him, and then walked across the cargo bay and stood in front of Soriel and looked up at him with the expression that meant she was running several assessments at the same time. She said, "How bad is your ship?" He said, "Flyable." She said, "Good. We have 2 critical, for serious, 5 stable. I need your med kit, whatever you have in emergency stores, and someone to help me get the criticals transferred first." He nodded and went back to the gilded talon for the kit. It took 4 hours to move everyone and stabilize what could be stabilized. Soriel was not a medic, but he had field training, and he followed instructions well, which Rin made clear was the relevant qualification. She told him what to do. He did it. When he did something wrong, she corrected him without comment. When he did something right, she moved on without comment. It was, he reflected, exactly how she operated. He learned the story in pieces during those 4 hours. The Harrow's Edge had been doing routine relief work in the Drath cluster when the drones appeared. No warning. No communication. They had simply moved into position and started scanning. The ship's captain had tried 3 times to hail them. No response. When the captain tried to leave, the drones blocked the exit vector. They had been held for 6 hours before Soriel arrived. Rin had been using the time to prepare, which meant treating everyone who had been hurt in the initial maneuvering and rigging the emergency thruster in the cargo bay into something that could throw mass at a fast-moving target, which required pulling apart 3 pieces of equipment and using the cargo bay's magnetic loading system in a way it was absolutely not designed to be used. The contractor captain, when Sorial's Imperial Intelligence Service caught up with him 3 days later, said he had been told she was an intelligence asset, a political loose thread that needed locating and documenting. He was to find her and confirm her position and wait for further instruction. He said he had not been told she was a medic. He said this as if it changed something. Sorial, when he read the transcript, thought that it probably did change something, though not in the way the contractor captain meant. When the last survivor was transferred and settled, Sorial sat down on the floor of the Gilded Talon's cargo section because all the chairs were occupied, and Rin sat down across from him and put her back against the wall and was quiet for a moment. He looked at the gash on her forehead. He said, "That needs to be properly closed." She said, "I know. I ran out of proper supplies 6 hours ago." He went to the kit, found what she needed, and came back. She let him do it without comment, which told him more than she probably intended about how tired she was. He worked carefully. Her skin was warmer than his, the way human skin always was, which he had never stopped finding interesting from a biological standpoint. When he was done, she said, "How did you find me?" He said, "The signal, the one I showed you in Canada." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wasn't sure you'd recognize it." He said, "I recognized it." She said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." He said, "I was always going to come." She looked at him, not the assessment look, something quieter. Then she said, "Sorial, before you say anything else, how bad is it at home?" He told her, all of it, the succession fracture, the 3 noble houses, Drath's message, the Tier Null file, the reason she had been targeted. He told her all of it plainly, the way she had always preferred, without softening it, because she had never once in his experience responded well to being managed. She listened to every word. Her expression did not change in the way most people's would. She did not get frightened or angry in a visible way. She went still in the way she went still when she was thinking hard about a problem. Then she said, "Okay." He waited. She said, "What do you need from me? Not what are you going to do? Not what happens next. What do you need from me?" He had known her for 3 years and studied humans for longer, and he still felt, in that moment, like he was looking at something he did not have a complete model for. He said, "I need to go back, and I think I need you to come with me." She looked at the 11 people settled around the Gilded Talon's cargo bay. She said, "We need to get them somewhere safe first." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then we'll talk about going back." She stood up, because there was still work to do, and went to check on the critical patients. Sorial stayed on the floor for a moment longer and looked at the ceiling. Outside the hull, the debris field drifted around them in the dark, quiet now. 3 fewer drones in the universe. 11 people breathing who had not been certain they would. He thought about the Tier Null file, about the word resilient, which appeared in it 11 times. He thought, the council used the right word. They just did not understand what it meant. Rin did not agree to go back to Draer Prime immediately. She agreed after the survivors were delivered to a neutral medical station in the outer edge of the Kareth corridor, after every one of the 11 people from the Harrow's Edge had been handed to facility staff with full written notes on their conditions, treatments administered, and any complications Rin had observed during the 6 hours she had been keeping them alive with supplies meant for 4. She wrote the notes by hand. She did not hand them off verbally and walk away. She stayed until she was confident the receiving team had read and understood each one. Only then did she walk back to the Gilded Talon, sit down in the co-pilot seat, which was too small, but less too small than the main seat, and say, "All right, explain the plan." Sorial explained the plan. He told her that returning to Draer Prime as a fugitive prince who had fled his own coronation was a losing position. But returning as a crown prince completing a classified assessment mission was a different thing. The Tier Null file existed. The mission had been to study humanity. He had been studying humanity for 3 years. He had a counter-report in progress, assembled from everything he had observed and researched, arguing for a complete reclassification of how the Empire understood and related to humans. The report needed a conclusion. The conclusion needed a demonstration. He told her he was bringing her back as the demonstration. Rin looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You want to bring me to the Imperial Court as evidence?" He said yes. She said, "That's the plan." He said it was the framework of the plan. There were details. She said, "What kind of details?" He explained the legal framework. Under imperial court law, anything presented as classified evidence in an active crown mission was under the personal protection of the presenting party. No one could act against it, question it, move against it, or interfere with it without explicit order from the crown presenter. Which meant as long as she was technically his evidence, she had more formal protection on Draer Prime than anywhere else in the known galaxy. She said, "So to keep me safe you're calling me evidence?" He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is such a stupid loophole that it might actually work." He said he thought so too. She said, "I need to send word to my organization. They need to know the Harrow's Edge is lost and where the crew ended up." He said he would arrange a secure relay. She said, "And I need actual food, not a nutrition block, something with flavor." He said the ship's stores were limited. She said, "Sorial." He said he would find something. He found something. It was not remarkable, but it was better than a nutrition block, and she ate it with the focused attention she gave to anything she considered a task worth completing. He ate across from her, and they were quiet for a while, which was not uncomfortable. They had spent a lot of time in companionable quiet in Canada, during the long hours when there was nothing to do but wait for his body to do what bodies did. And she had told him that she was not a person who needed to fill silence, and he had said that he was not either. He pulled up his counter report on the navigation display, because the display was the largest screen on the ship, and she read it while he flew the first leg toward the jump point. She read for a long time. He had been writing the report for 2 years, adding to it after every session with the Imperial science teams, every human history text he finished, every conversation with her. It was long. It was detailed. It argued, in formal Imperial academic language that had taken him 6 months to calibrate correctly, that the entire framework the Empire used to classify new species was built on assumptions about what made a civilization survive, and that humanity broke every one of those assumptions, not by being superior, but by being different in ways the models were not built to measure. He heard her stop scrolling at one point. He waited. She said, "You wrote this in 2 years." He said yes. She said, "While also being a crown prince." He said the two activities had unfortunately overlapping schedules. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something more complicated. She kept reading. She found the threat assessment section. The Tier Null file's conclusion. The sentence the Imperial Science Council had settled on after all their models and metrics and 3 rounds of checking. Handle with care. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "That's a first." He glanced at her. He asked what she meant. She said, "Usually people just try to handle us." She said it simply, like something obvious, like something she had never needed to say aloud before, because it had always just been true. She went back to reading. He flew the ship. He thought about what she had said for the rest of the leg. By the time they reached the first jump point, he had added a paragraph to the report's conclusion. It was the shortest paragraph in the document. It was also, he thought, the one that would land hardest on the court. The 12 days to Draer Prime were not quiet. They were also not tense. They were the kind of days that have a quality he did not have a precise word for in his language, where 2 people are in close quarters with a great deal to discuss and not enough time to discuss at all, and both of them know it and find that fact almost acceptable. They talked about the report. She pushed back on 2 of his conclusions, and she was right about one of them, and they argued about the other for an entire afternoon and did not resolve it, which she found less satisfying than he did, because he was used to unresolved arguments, and she had a practical person's preference for getting to the answer. They talked about Canada. About the 2 days and 3 nights she had kept him alive in a forest shelter she built from cut branches and emergency blankets, because his ship had no locator and she was not going to leave him alone while she went for help. She said she had told her organization afterward that she had treated an injured survey team member who had lost his supplies, and that his appearance was due to a congenital condition, and she was fairly sure 2 of her supervisors had not believed her and had decided not to ask. He told her that his mission debrief had listed her as an unknown civilian contact, helpful. He said this was the most understated entry in the entire survey log, which ran to 400 pages. She said, "Helpful." He said, "I believe the field agent who wrote it was attempting to keep the language neutral." She said, "Did it work?" He said, The Science Council asked me 47 follow-up questions specifically about you. She looked at him. Then she looked back at the display and said, that explains some things. On the 10th day, she read the final section of his counter-report and did not speak for a long time after. Then she said, Soriel, you left the throne for this. He said, I left the throne because the throne could wait. She waited. He said, you could not. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, that is either very brave or very reckless. He said, my tutors would say both. She said, I think your tutors would be right. On the 12th day, the Gilded Talon dropped out of FTL at the outer edge of the Dracker Prime system. 27 warships were waiting. Soriel looked at the sensor display. He had expected pursuit. He had not expected quite this number. The formation told him the fleet had been organized not by the Chancellor, who favored efficiency, but by someone who wanted to make an impression. He opened a channel. He announced himself, Crown Prince Soriel of the Drakarath Imperial Line, returning from a classified mission under the direct authority of the Imperial Succession Charter, Section 12, Clause 4, which gave the Crown Prince the right to conduct independent assessment missions without prior court approval. He said this without checking the charter because he had memorized it at age 9 and had never forgotten it because he had suspected since age 14 that he would eventually need it. He said he was bringing a piece of classified evidence under direct Crown protection. He said to make a hole. There was a pause of 11 seconds. The fleet moved. Soriel flew the Gilded Talon through the gap, battered portside panel and all, at exactly the speed a Crown Prince returning from a classified mission ought to fly, which was unhurried and without deviation from the direct line, because showing any sign of uncertainty to 27 warships was not something his tutors would have approved of. From the co-pilot seat, Rin watched the warships on the display without comment. He glanced at her. She said, don't look at me. Keep flying. He kept flying. She said, how many people are going to be in that room? He thought about it. He said, several thousand. She said, right. She said nothing else for the remainder of the approach. But she sat up a little straighter, and she looked at the planet getting larger in the view screen with the expression she wore when she was preparing to do something that was going to be hard, and she had already decided to do it anyway. He thought about the report's opening line, which he had written and rewritten 12 times over 2 years before arriving at the version that said simply, this is what they are. He thought it was correct. Vareth the Ancient was not dead. Soriel had prepared himself for the possibility, during the 12 days of travel, that his father might be gone before he returned. He had made a kind of internal peace with it, not easily, but completely, the way he did things that had to be done. He had decided what he would do if the throne was already empty, which was a different and harder problem than the one he was walking into now. Instead, Vareth was in the throne room, not on the medical supports. In armor, old armor, the kind that had been in the Imperial family for 6 generations, that fit Vareth's frame the way his second skin did. He was sitting in the throne as if he had never left it, surrounded by the full Imperial court, every noble house represented, every general in formal dress, and the kind of silence that rooms full of powerful people produce when something is happening that none of them had predicted. He looked at Soriel. He looked at Run. He said, this is the human. Soriel said, yes. Vareth said, she is smaller than I expected. Rin said, so are you. The court did not breathe. Soriel had a brief moment of considering whether to intervene and deciding against it. Rin had said it without aggression, in the plain way she said most things, as a simple statement of observation. It landed the way it landed because no one in 4,000 years of the Drakarath Empire had apparently looked at the Emperor and said anything like it. Vareth looked at her for a long time. His expression did not change. Then he said, begin. What followed was 4 hours of the most formal and most important conversation Soriel had ever been part of. He spoke first, because it was his mission and his report and his right under the charter clause he had cited on the approach. He stood in the center of the court floor, where the light came down from the ceiling in long gold bars, and he spoke without notes. He had been thinking about what he would say in this room for 2 years. He had written it in the report. He had rewritten it. He had argued pieces of it with Rin in transit. He knew the structure the way he knew the coronation oath, which was to say completely, in his bones, without having to retrieve it consciously. He started with the Tier Null file. He stated its existence openly, in court, which was the first time it had been acknowledged outside the sealed imperial record. He heard movement in the room when he said the words. He did not pause for it. He described what the file said, the extinction events, the recovery, the numbers that should not add up and did. He described it in plain language, not the careful phrasing of the council, because plain language was harder to dismiss. He described the 3 years he had spent on Earth and in proximity to humanity, the histories he had read, the patterns he had documented, the way humans responded to catastrophe by building connections instead of severing them, which was counterintuitive, which had been checked 3 times, and which was, in his assessment, the thing that made them different from every other species in the imperial database in a way that mattered. He described Ren. He did this precisely as he had described anything in the report, because the court operated on evidence, and the evidence was standing 12 feet behind him in a field jacket. He described every decision she had made from the moment he had landed, damaged, in her jurisdiction, to the moment she had used a jury-rigged cargo thruster to destroy a military drone that was about to kill him. He described her choice to go silent to protect him. He described her first question when they found each other, which was not about herself. He said, "This is not an anomaly. This is a pattern. This is what they are. And the correct question is not how to manage them. It is what happens when we do not." Then he presented the contractor evidence. The attack on the Harrow's Edge. The House Civil markings on the drones. The mission log retrieved from the destroyed units that showed the order had originated from a communication relay registered to House Civil's private network. House Civil's senior representative began to object. 3 words in, Drath raised one hand. The representative stopped. Drath listened to everything. He asked 6 questions, sharp ones, the kind that meant he had been listening to every word and had identified the exact points that needed pressure. Soriel answered all 6 without deflection. Then Drath said, "Bring her forward." Ren walked to the center of the floor and stood next to Soriel. The court looked at her. She looked back at the court. She did not perform anything. She did not make herself larger or smaller than she was. She stood the way she stood when she was waiting for something that needed doing. Drath said, "You are Ren Calloway." She said yes. He said, "My son has spent 2 years writing a document about your species. He has interrupted his own coronation. He has crossed imperial space in a ship that I am told has a hole in the side." She said, "The pressure seals held." Drath said, "He has done all of this because he believes you and your kind represent something the Empire has not correctly understood." She said, "I wouldn't know about that." He said, "What would you know about?" She said, "I know that where I work, the question isn't usually what kind of person you are. It's what's wrong and can I help? That's most of it." The room was very still. Drath said, after a moment, "That is most of it." He ruled. House Civil was formally censured, which in imperial law was not a small thing. It meant sanctions, restricted access, and a public record of misconduct that would follow the house for 2 generations. The contractor operation was declared an illegal act against protected diplomatic personnel, and the captain and principals involved were remanded to imperial custody. The Tier Null classification on humanity was lifted. Drath created a new classification on the floor of the court, without committee or deliberation, which was his right as emperor. The translation from the old tongue was approximate. It came out as something like pure category, provisional. First contact of that kind in imperial history. Not a threat assessment. Not a resource category. A recognition. Soriel was confirmed as crown prince. The coronation was rescheduled. This time he stood through all 47 lines and finished the last word, which felt, now, less like a lock closing and more like a door opening. After, the court began to empty, the way it always did after long sessions, in clusters of conversation and negotiation and the quiet maneuvering that never stopped regardless of what had just been decided. A man crossed the floor toward Ren. He was old and very large, even for a Dracorath, and he wore the decorations of a career that had involved 12 different conflicts across 4 decades. His name was General Orcs, and he was the senior military figure in the room, and he had not spoken during the session, but he had not looked away from Soriel's presentation once. He stopped in front of Ren. He said, "Is it true that on your world, You had no empire to organize you, and you still built all of that. She said, yes. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at her the way Soriel had seen him look at tactical problems. Not with contempt, with attention. Then he said, we have been building empires for 4,000 years because we believed it was the only way to hold civilization together. That without structure, species collapse. We have the evidence. We have watched it happen. We built our entire understanding of the galaxy around it. He paused. He said, you did not know that. She said, I guess we just didn't get the memo. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, I will need to ask you what a memo is. She said, it's a message. Usually one people ignore. He thought about this. He said, yes, that is what we did. He walked away. Soriel watched him go and then looked at Run, who was watching the general leave with the expression she wore when she had said something that landed differently than she expected and was deciding how to feel about it. He said, you know he is going to file a report about that conversation. She said, that's fine. He said, he is also going to want to speak with you again. She said, that's also fine. He said, probably many people are going to want to speak with you. She said, Soriel. He said, yes. She said, can we find somewhere to sit down? They found the corridor outside the throne room, which was empty because everyone was still inside talking. The floor was cold stone and the walls were old, and the light came in low and gold through a long window at the end. It was quiet. Rin sat down on the floor with her back against the wall. Soriel sat down next to her, which was easier said than done given the difference in their frames and the narrowness of the corridor, but he managed it. She reached into the pocket of her field jacket and produced a nutrition bar, the compact kind made for long field rotations. She looked at it. She broke it in half without saying anything and held out one half. He took it. They sat there in the corridor outside the throne room of the Dracorath Empire and ate the nutrition bar in the quiet, while inside, for 1,000 years of an empire worked out what it was going to do with the fact that the galaxy was larger and stranger than it had believed. After a while, Rin said, your father asked me if I would consider a diplomatic liaison position. He said, I know. She said, I told him I would think about it. He said, I know. She said, I'm going to need to go home first. He said, I know. She looked at him sidelong. She said, you memorized the coronation oath at age 6. He said, I did. She said, and you stopped one word from the end. He said, I did. She said, and then you came and found me. He said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the long window, the sky above Dracker Prime was going dark at the edges, the deep blue that came before the stars appeared. She said, okay. He said, okay what? She said, okay, I'll think about the liaison position seriously. He said, that is not what I was waiting for you to say. She said, I know what you were waiting for me to say. He waited. She said, I'm glad you came. He said, I was always going to come. She said, I know. The stars came out over Dracker Prime, one by one, the way they always did, without asking anyone's permission, following no empire's schedule, following nothing but their own old light. Soriel finished half a nutrition bar on a cold corridor floor and thought that for someone who had walked out of his own coronation 3 weeks ago, things had resolved to a remarkably good position. Rin leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, because she had not slept properly in days and the crisis was over for now, and her body had apparently decided that now was when it would send that information. He did not wake her. He sat there until she was asleep, and then he sat there a while longer, looking at the stars through the window and thinking about a forest in northern Canada and a woman with a torch and a first aid kit who had knelt down in the mud and said, we work with what we have. He thought, yes, that is exactly what we do.